The call that didn't make sense. The call came at 2:14 a.m., sharp and deliberate, cutting to the kind of silence that usually means nothing is wrong. I almost ignored it. Unknown number, no contact ID, no reason for anyone to call me at that hour. The city outside my apartment window was quiet, steady, unchanged. Streetlights still burned in neat intervals. A car passed somewhere in the distance, tires rolling over asphalt like it always did. Everything suggested normal. The call suggested otherwise. I let it ring twice more before answering. Yeah, there was no hesitation on the other end. No confusion. Just a voice, calm, controlled, and already in motion. You have 72 hours. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I didn't hear it, but because the sentence didn't fit anything real. It sounded rehearsed, stripped of emotion, like something delivered to multiple people before me. Who is this? I asked. That doesn't matter, the voice said. Same tone, same pace. What matters is that you leave the city before it locks down. Locks down, not evacuates, not shuts down. Locks. I sat up slowly, the phone pressed tighter against my ear. The room around me felt smaller, like the air had shifted without warning. Still, I forced logic into place. This isn't funny, I said. If this is some kind of... Route 9 will be congested first. The voice cut in. Avoid it. Head north or west. Do not wait for official instructions. That stopped me. Not the warning itself, but the specificity. Route 9 was a major artery out of the city. Anyone could guess it would be crowded in a crisis. But the way it was said, flat, certain, like it had already happened. Why? I asked, what's happening? A pause. Not long, but deliberate. You'll understand in 48 hours. By then, it will be too late to move without risk. My grip tightened on the phone. Too late for what? No answer. Just a faint sound of breathing on the other end. Steady, measured, like whoever was speaking had no reason to rush. Then, prepare now. Leave early. Don't bring anyone who hesitates. That last part lingered longer than it should have. Wait, I said. Who told you to call me? Another pause. This one heavier. You were flagged. The voice said, flagged. For what? I asked, but the line went dead. I stayed there for a few seconds, phone still against my ear, listening to nothing. No dial tone, no background noise, just silence returning to fill the space the voice had occupied. Outside, the city hadn't changed. A light flicked on in a neighboring building. Somewhere below, a car door shut. Normal sounds. Familiar patterns. Nothing about the world suggested urgency. Nothing justified what I'd just heard. I checked the call log. No number. Just unknown. That should have made it easier to dismiss. Instead, it made it harder. I got out of bed and walked to the window. The street looked exactly the same as it had hours before. Orderly, predictable, safe. A delivery truck idled at the corner. A man crossed the street without looking over his shoulder. No one moved like time was running out. But the voice hadn't sounded uncertain. That was the problem. People making jokes hesitate. They over-explain or they break tone. This voice didn't. It delivered information like it expected to be followed. No emotion, no urgency, just instruction. 72 hours. I tried to reconstruct the logic. Maybe it was a scam, a prank, someone pulling from public data, making educated guesses. It was possible, even likely. But then there was the timing. 2:14 a.m. Not random, not convenient. Chosen. And the phrasing. You were flagged. I didn't like that part. I stepped back from the window and looked around my apartment. Everything in its place. Work bag by the door. Keys on the counter. Laptop still open from earlier that night. It all felt stable, anchored in routine. The call didn't fit into any of it, which meant one of two things. Either it was nothing, and I'd lose sleep over a meaningless interruption, or it was something, and ignore it would cost more than sleep. I stood there for a long minute, letting both possibilities settle. Then I reached for my keys. Patterns no one else noticed. Morning came like it always did. Slow light through the blinds, distant traffic building into a steady rhythm. The city waking without urgency. If I hadn't taken the call, nothing about the day would have felt different. That was the problem. Everything looked the same, but I couldn't stop measuring it against what I'd heard. I left the apartment earlier than usual, keys already in my hand. The street was active, people moving with purpose, coffee in one hand, phones in the other. No one looked like they had 72 hours to leave. No one moved like anything was about to change. At the corner, a police cruiser idled longer than it should have. 2 officers sat inside, not talking, not checking anything, just watching traffic pass. It wasn't unusual by itself, but it stayed with me. There was no reason for them to be there that early. Not without a visible cause. I kept walking. The first real inconsistency came from something small. A city bus pulled up to stop, doors opening on schedule, but only 2 people got off. The rest stayed seated, staring forward. Normally, that route was crowded in the morning. Today, it looked half empty. Not enough to raise alarms. Just enough to feel off. Inside the convenience store, the clerk was restocking bottled water. Not a few cases, an entire wall. He moved quickly, stacking without stopping, barely acknowledging customers. Busy morning? I asked. He shrugged without looking up. Supply came early. Manager said get it out. There was nothing strange in the words, but the pace didn't match them. He wasn't restocking. He was rushing. I paid and stepped outside, scanning the street again. Still normal. Still predictable. But the details weren't lining up. On my way to work, I checked the news. Headlines were clean, controlled, routine. Traffic reports, minor incidents, nothing out of place. But one article caught my attention, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. Regional Health Advisory issued. No details in the preview. No urgency in the wording. Just a vague statement about monitoring conditions and no immediate risk to the public. It read like something designed to calm people, without actually informing them. I opened it. Halfway through, the tone shifted. Subtle, but there. Terms I contain and localized appeared without explanation. No source cited. No timeline given. It wasn't information, it was positioning. I closed the article. At the office, nothing felt different on the surface. People worked, talked, complained about the same things they always did. Conversation stayed shallow, focused on routine. But underneath it, something else was moving. 2 co-workers were arguing quietly near the break room. I'm telling you, my cousin works at the hospital. One said, they're moving patients out of certain wings. For what? The other asked. They didn't say, just that it's temporary. Temporary. That word again used to explain something without actually explaining it. I didn't join the conversation. I didn't need to. I was already seeing the pattern. Isolated incidents. Each one explainable on its own. Together, they formed something harder to ignore. Police presence without cause. Reduced public movement. Supply shifts. Controlled messaging. Quiet evacuations. None of it confirmed anything. But none of it felt random either. By midday, the city still looked intact. Traffic flowed. Stores stayed open. People laughed, argued, lived like they always did. If something was coming, it hadn't touched the surface yet. That contrast made it worse. Because it meant the change wasn't visible. It was structural. I stepped outside during lunch and watched the street from a distance. Patterns became clearer when you stopped moving. An ambulance passed without sirens. Another followed 10 minutes later. Same route, same silence. That wasn't standard. Emergency vehicles didn't move quietly unless they were told to. I checked my phone again. No alerts. No warnings. Nothing official. 72 hours. I replayed the call in my head, this time against what I was seeing. The voice hadn't sounded uncertain. It hadn't sounded like a guess. It sounded like someone who already knew how this would unfold. The question wasn't whether something was happening. The question was whether I was early enough to act on it. I looked around one more time, at the people, the traffic, the illusion of stability holding everything together. No one else was reacting, which meant if I did, I'd be doing it alone. That should have made the decision harder. It didn't. It made it clearer. The decision that broke routine. By the time I got home, the city had settled into its usual rhythm. Evening traffic crawled past my building in predictable waves, headlights stretching down the street like nothing had changed. People moved with the same unhurried confidence they always had, grocery bags in hand, conversations half finished, plans extending into the weekend. If I hadn't been looking for it, I might have believed everything was still intact. That was the pressure point. Normalcy doesn't just hide problems, it protects them. It gives you reasons to wait. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, letting it close quietly behind me. The apartment felt smaller than it had that morning, like it was already becoming temporary. I stood there for a moment, keys still in my hand, and forced the situation into something measurable. 72 hours. Not a suggestion, not a possibility. A window. If the call was wrong, acting on it would cost me time, money, and whatever credibility I had left with people who expected consistency. If it was right, waiting would cost me options. Options mattered more. I set the keys down and pulled a duffel bag from the closet. Not everything, just what I could justify without turning the decision into something emotional. Clothes, minimal, practical. I wasn't packing to leave permanently. I was preparing to move quickly if I had to. That distinction mattered, at least at first. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Ryan. You still coming tonight? I stared at it longer than I should have. Thursday nights were routine. Same place, same group, same predictable conversations. It was the kind of structure that made everything else feel stable. I typed a response, erased it, then typed again. Can't make it. Busy. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Busy with what? I didn't answer. Instead, I moved into the kitchen and started pulling items from cabinets. Water first. Easy to justify. People bought extra water all the time. Then non-perishables. Things that wouldn't draw attention if someone saw them in my cart later. The process was methodical, but the reason behind it wasn't entirely clean. Every item I picked up carried a question. Was I preparing for something real or reacting to a voice I couldn't verify? That uncertainty stayed with me. But it didn't stop me. It couldn't, because the alternative was doing nothing. And I'd already seen enough to know that doing nothing was its own kind of decision. I checked the time. Still early. Stores would be open, roads still clear. If I waited until morning, the margin would shrink. Not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice. But enough. I grabbed my jacket and headed back out. The grocery store was brighter than usual, or maybe I was just noticing it more. People moved through the aisles without urgency, filling carts, checking lists, living inside routines that hadn't been disrupted yet. I kept my pace steady. Water aisle first. Half stocked, not empty, not alarming, just lower than it should have been for that time of day. A man beside me loaded 2 cases into his cart, then paused, like he was considering a third. He didn't take it. That hesitation told me more than the shelves did. I moved on. Canned goods, batteries, basic supplies. Nothing extreme, nothing that would mark me as reacting to something specific. I kept it balanced. Enough to matter, not enough to stand out. At checkout, the cashier scanned items without looking up. Storm coming, she asked. Something like that. I said. She nodded, accepting the answer without question. It fit into her version of reality. Weather made sense. It was predictable, manageable. What I was preparing for wasn't. Back outside, the air felt different. Not heavier, not colder, just sharper, like something had shifted beneath the surface. Traffic still moved. People still talked. But I couldn't stop seeing the gaps between actions, the pauses, the small inconsistencies that didn't belong. I loaded everything into my car and sat behind the wheel without starting it. This was a point where I could still stop, return the supplies, go back upstairs, re-enter routine like nothing had happened. No one would question it. No one would notice, except me, because I'd already crossed a line that mattered, not in what I'd done, but in how I was thinking. I wasn't waiting for confirmation anymore. I was acting on probability. That changed everything. I started the engine and pulled out into traffic, already mapping routes in my head. Not just how to leave, but when and under what conditions. If certain roads slowed, I'd shift. If the city restricted movement, I'd already be ahead of it. It wasn't panic. It was adjustment. And once you start adjusting, you don't go back to ignoring, even if the world still looks the same. Especially then. Quiet preparation while the city slept. I didn't turn the lights on when I got back. The street outside provided enough illumination to move through the apartment without drawing attention. It wasn't paranoia, it was control. Light signals activity. Activity invites questions. Questions slow things down. I set the bags on the counter and unpacked them in silence, organizing everything by use rather than category. Water near the door. Food separated by weight and shelf life. Batteries and tools within reach, not buried. Every placement had a purpose. If I had to leave quickly, hesitation couldn't be part of the process. The city outside kept moving. I could hear it through the window. Distant engines, footsteps, the low hum of people existing inside routines that hadn't been interrupted yet. That contrast stayed sharp in my mind. They were living normally. I was preparing for something that hadn't been confirmed. That made every decision feel heavier. I sat down at the table and opened my laptop, pulling up a map of the city and the surrounding highways. Route 9 was already marked in my head. Avoid it. That left alternatives, each with trade-offs. North routes were longer but less congested. West cut through tighter infrastructure, faster but harder to navigate if things stalled. I traced paths with my finger, not just looking at distance but choke points, bridges, intersections, areas where movement could collapse under pressure. The goal wasn't the fastest route. It was the most reliable. Reliability meant options. I marked 3 routes. Primary, secondary, fallback. If one failed, I wouldn't stop to think. I'd shift. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. Not because it had changed, but because I was measuring time differently now. 72 hours wasn't abstract anymore. It was a countdown I had already started. I closed the laptop and moved to the closet again, this time pulling out items I hadn't considered earlier. Things that didn't seem essential until you imagined not having them. A flashlight I rarely used. A small first aid kit. A jacket built for colder weather than I expected to face. Each addition forced a calculation. Weight versus usefulness. Speed versus preparation. Too much, and I'd slow myself down. Too little, and I'd depend on variables I couldn't control. I packed deliberately, adjusting as I went, removing items that felt unnecessary, adding ones that solved specific problems. The bag wasn't about comfort. It was about function. My phone buzzed again. Ryan, you good? You're acting weird. I stared at the message, thumb hovering over the screen. Explaining it would sound irrational. There was no evidence I could point to, no clear reason that justified the shift in behavior. And the call, if I mentioned it, wouldn't help. It would make everything sound worse. I'm fine, I typed back, just handling some things. The response came quickly. At 10 p.m., I didn't reply. Instead, I turned the phone face down and continued working. Conversations like that weren't useful. They pulled attention away from decisions that needed to be made without interference. Still, the friction lingered. Not because I doubted the preparation, but because I understood how it looked from the outside. Overreaction, paranoia, acting on incomplete information. All valid conclusions if you only saw the surface. But I wasn't operating on the surface anymore. I moved to the window and looked out again. The same street, the same lights. A couple walking past, talking quietly. A car slowing at the intersection, turning without hesitation. No signs of disruption. No visible threat. Just continuity. That was the most dangerous part. Because continuity convinces you there's time. I stepped back and checked the bag one more time, running through the contents mentally. Water, food, tools, light, basic medical. Enough to move, not enough to settle. Temporary readiness. That was the goal. I placed the bag near the door and set my keys beside it, aligning everything so there would be no delay if I needed to leave. Then I paused, looking at the setup from a distance. It didn't look extreme. It looked intentional. And that difference mattered. Because preparation isn't just about having the right things. It's about committing to the possibility that you'll use them. I turned off the remaining light in the room and sat down, letting the quiet settle in. Outside, the city continued uninterrupted. Inside, everything had shifted. I wasn't waiting for confirmation anymore. I was preparing for consequence. The first sign something was wrong, the first real sign, didn't come from the news. It came from silence. Not the absence of sound, but the wrong kind of quiet. The kind that settles where something should be happening and isn't. I noticed it on my way back from a second supply run, just past noon, when traffic along the main intersection near my apartment slowed without cause. No accident. No visible obstruction. Just hesitation. Cars edged forward in uneven bursts, drivers leaning slightly over their wheels like they were trying to see something ahead that wasn't resolving. I pulled into a side lane and stepped out, keeping my distance. Whatever it wasn't loud enough to draw a crowd, but it was enough to interrupt flow. That alone mattered. People don't stop moving unless something forces them to. I moved closer, not directly into the intersection, but enough to get a line of sight. At first, it looked like nothing, just a delivery van angled awkwardly across one lane. Driver's side door open. Then I saw the driver. He was on the ground beside the van, not sprawled, not obviously injured, just wrong. His body was angled in a way that didn't suggest impact. One arm twisted beneath him, the other gripping the pavement like he'd tried to steady himself and failed. A woman stood a few feet away. Phone pressed her ear. "I don't know," she was saying. "He just got out, and he's not responding." Her voice wasn't panicked. Confused more than anything. That detail stayed with me. If this were normal, if it were a heart attack, a seizure, anything familiar, there would be urgency, movement, someone kneeling beside him, checking for signs of life. But no one touched him. They stayed back, forming a loose perimeter, without meaning to. Waiting. I scanned the scene again. No blood, no visible trauma. Just stillness where there should have been reaction. An ambulance arrived within minutes, faster than expected. It pulled in without sirens, lights flashing but muted, like they didn't want attention. 2 paramedics stepped out. They didn't rush. That was the second sign. They approached carefully, controlled, like they already knew what they were dealing with. One of them put on gloves before even kneeling down. The other spoke briefly into a radio, voice low, words too quiet to catch. No one asked questions. No one explained anything. They checked him quickly, too quickly, and then one of them shook his head. "Get the stretcher," he said. Flat. No urgency. No attempt to revive. The woman with the phone lowered it slowly. "Is he?" she started. The paramedic didn't answer her. He was already moving, already disengaging from the moment, like it had been resolved. That's when the driver moved. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden jerk, no violent reaction. Just a small shift, his hand tightening against the pavement. Fingers curling with slow, deliberate pressure. The paramedic froze. Just for a second. Then he stepped back. "Sir," he said louder now. The driver didn't respond. But he wasn't still anymore. That was enough. The loose circle around him tightened, not physically but mentally. People took a step back without thinking, space widening between them, and whatever was happening on the ground. I felt it too. Not fear, not yet. Recognition. This didn't fit anything normal. The paramedics exchanged a look. Not confusion. Not surprise. Confirmation. One of them reached for something on his belt, then stopped, reconsidered, and stepped back again. "Load him," he said. But his tone had changed. There was hesitation in it now. The stretcher came out. They worked quickly, but not efficiently, like they were following procedure, without fully trusting it. They lifted the driver onto it, securing him without meeting each other's eyes. No one explained what had happened. No one asked why. The ambulance doors closed, and within seconds it pulled away, still without sirens. The intersection cleared slowly after that, traffic resuming in uneven waves. People returned to their routines. Conversations restarting. Phones coming back out like the interruption had been temporary, like it had already been explained. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching the space where it happened. No markings. No signs. Just pavement. To anyone else, it was an isolated incident. Something strange but explainable. To me, it wasn't. It was a pattern breaking through. The call, the quiet changes, the controlled responses. And now this. Not chaos. Not yet, but something underneath it. Something structure contained and already moving. I turned and walked back to my car, the timeline in my head shifting without permission. 72 hours didn't feel accurate anymore. It felt optimistic. Locking in the escape plan. By the time I got back to the apartment, the city had already absorbed the incident and moved on. Traffic patterns smoothed out. Pedestrians filled the sidewalks again, and whatever had happened at the intersection dissolved into something people could ignore. That was the difference between noticing and acting. Most people notice. Almost no one adjusted. I closed the door behind me and locked it, not out of fear, but out of habit, one of the few routines that still made sense. Then I went straight to the table and opened the map again. This time, I wasn't exploring options. I was choosing. Primary route first. Northbound, avoiding major highways for as long as possible. It added time, but reduced exposure congestion. I traced the path slowly, marking turns mentally instead of relying on GPS. If networks failed, or worse, if they were restricted, I couldn't depend on real-time navigation. Secondary route ran west, cutting across smaller roads that fed into a state highway. Faster in theory, but tighter. More points of failure. If traffic stalled there would be no easy way around it. Fallback wasn't a route so much as a direction. Get out of the city perimeter by any available means and reassess from there. Not ideal, but necessary. I leaned back in the chair, looking at the 3 paths laid out in front of me. None of them were perfect. Each carried risk. The difference was in how controllable that risk was once things started to break down. That was the metric that mattered. Control. I checked the time again. Late afternoon. Still within the window where leaving would look unnecessary, maybe even irrational. No official warnings. No visible collapse. Just patterns that only made sense if you were already looking for them. That was the pressure point. Leave too early and you waste resources. Isolate yourself. Maybe even cut off options that would have remained open. Leave too late, and the decision gets made for you. I stood up and moved to the window again. The street below looked exactly the same as it had that morning. People moved without urgency. Conversations overlapping. Cars flowing to the intersection in predictable cycles. If I walked out now with everything I'd packed, it would stand out, not because it was extreme, but because it didn't match the environment. That mismatch carried its own risk. Attention. I stepped back and turned toward the bag near the door, running to the plan again, not just routes, but timing. Leaving during peak hours would trap me in the same patterns everyone else relied on. Leaving at night reduced visibility, but increased unpredictability. Fewer people, fewer obstacles, but also fewer variables I could read in advance. Early morning. That was the balance point. Before full activity, but after enough movement to mask my own. I set that as a departure window. Not flexible, not negotiable. If nothing changed overnight, I would leave anyway. That decision settled something internally. It removed the need to keep reevaluating every detail against uncertainty. The plan didn't require confirmation anymore. It required execution. Still, there were gaps. I moved through the apartment again, this time looking for anything I'd missed. Documents first. Identification, cash, anything that wouldn't be replaceable if systems went down. I gathered them into a small folder and slid it into the bag. Then the car. I stepped outside and checked it manually. Fuel just above half. Not enough. I drove to the nearest station, keeping my movements casual, nothing rushed. The station was open, lights bright, people moving through without concern. A man at the next pump complained about prices. Another checked his phone while the tank filled. Normal. I topped off the tank and then filled a small reserve container I kept in the trunk. Not obvious, not excessive, just enough to extend range if needed. Back in the driver's seat, I didn't start the engine immediately. I watched the station for a minute, scanning for anything that didn't fit. Nothing obvious. That didn't mean nothing was wrong. It meant whatever was wrong hadn't reached the surface yet. I drove back slowly, committing the route to memory in reverse. Landmarks, turns, alternate paths. If I had to move without thinking, I needed those patterns already in place. When I returned, the light was fading. The city transitioned into evening without disruption. Just another day closing out. I carried the bag inside and set it by the door again. Everything aligned for a single movement. Keys, bag, exit. No hesitation. I stood there for a moment, looking at the setup, then at the rest of the apartment. The parts one wasn't taking. That was the final calculation. Not what I was bringing, what I was leaving behind. Because leaving early means accepting that you might not come back. And stay means accepting that you might not get the chance to leave. I turned off the lights and sat down in the dark. The plan fixed now. No longer theoretical. Morning wasn't far. And for the first time since the call, the uncertainty didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a deadline. The moment the city shifted, I woke up before the alarm. Not because I'd slept well, but because something felt off before I even opened my eyes. The kind of awareness that doesn't come from sound, but from absence. The city usually had a rhythm in the early morning. Distant traffic, movement building slowly into noise. That rhythm wasn't there. I sat up, already alert, and checked the time. 5:12 a.m. Still within the window, I'd planned to leave. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. I moved the window and looked out. The street below wasn't empty, but it wasn't normal either. Cars were there, but parked at odd angles. A few people stood outside, not moving with purpose. Just watching, waiting. For what, I couldn't tell. I grabbed my phone. No signal. Not weak. Gone. I switched to data. Nothing. That was the first system failure. Not delayed. Not degraded. Removed. I didn't hesitate after that. I moved fast, but controlled. Bag over my shoulder, keys in hand. Everything exactly where I'd left it. No wasted movement. No second guessing. This was the moment the plan stopped being theoretical. As I stepped into the hallway, something else hit me. Silence. Not complete, but wrong. Doors closed. No morning routines. No elevators moving. The building felt occupied, but inactive, like people were awake, just not moving. I took the stairs. The elevator wasn't worth the risk. If power dropped mid-descent, I'd lose time I couldn't afford. Each step echoed more than it should have. On the ground floor, the front doors were open, not propped, left. That detail mattered. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. Not temperature, tension. The kind that builds when people don't understand what's happening but know something is wrong. A man across the street was arguing into his phone. I don't care what they said. It's not working. No, nothing is working. He pulled the phone away, stared at it, then slammed it against his palm like that would fix it. Another system failure. Communication wasn't just down, it was unexpected. People hadn't been warned. That confirmed it. I moved toward my car, keeping my pace steady, not drawing attention. Panic spreads faster when it sees itself reflected. Right now, people were confused, not reactive. That window wouldn't last. I unlocked the car and got in, starting the engine immediately. It turned over without hesitation, one system still intact. For now, as I pulled onto the street, I noticed more irregularities. Traffic lights were still functioning, but not syncing correctly. One intersection stayed green too long. Another cycled too quickly, creating hesitation where there should have been flow. Drivers noticed. They slowed. They looked around. They adjusted. Not panic yet, but the structure was weakening. I turned onto my primary route, keeping distance from other vehicles. The goal wasn't speed. It was movement without interruption. Up ahead, an ambulance blocked part of the road. No sirens, just parked at an angle, doors open. Two paramedics stood beside a stretcher. Empty. That was wrong. I slowed just enough to see past them. A figure moved in the street beyond, unsteady, uneven, not injured in a way that made sense. Not walking with direction, just moving. One of the paramedics took a step forward, then stopped. The other grabbed his arm. "Don't," he said. I couldn't hear it clearly, but I saw it. The hesitation. The same kind I'd seen the day before. Recognition, not confusion. They knew something, and they weren't in control of it. The figure turned slightly, movements jerking, delayed, like signals weren't aligning properly. Then it stumbled forward again, faster than it should have. The paramedics stepped back, not to help, to create distance. That was a shift, not the movement, the reaction to it. I didn't wait to see more. I accelerated, passing the scene before it could escalate into something that trapped me there. In the rear-view mirror, I saw one of them reach for something on his belt again, this time not hesitating. Too late for them. Not for me. The road ahead stayed clear, but the pattern had broken, systems failing, behavior changing, responses delayed. This wasn't a single incident anymore. It was spreading. I tightened my grip on the wheel, recalculating without stopping. Every second now mattered more than the last. The margin I'd planned for was shrinking in real time. 72 hours had turned into something closer to 24. Maybe less. The city hadn't collapsed, but it had shifted. And once something shifts like this, it doesn't stabilize. It accelerates. I didn't look back again. There was nothing behind me I could use. Only everything ahead that I still might. Escaping before was too late. The first mile held together. Traffic moved, not smoothly, but predictably enough that I could maintain distance and adjust without braking hard. Most drivers were still operating inside routine, stopping at lights, signaling turns, following rules that no longer matched the situation. That was the advantage of moving early. The system was still in place, even if it was starting to fail. By the third intersection, that advantage started to slip. A cluster of cars had formed ahead, not from volume, but from hesitation. One driver stopped too long at a green light. The car behind him edged around, cutting into another lane. Someone honked, short, sharp, unnecessary. It didn't resolve anything. It just spread uncertainty. I slowed, scanning for exits before I needed them. This wasn't congestion yet. It was friction, and friction turns into blockage faster than people expect. I took a side street before the buildup could solidify, shifting onto a narrower road that paralleled my primary route. Fewer cars, tighter spacing, but more control. That trade-off only works if you take it early. Wait too long, and even alternatives collapse under overflow. As I moved through the side streets, I started seeing the change in behavior more clearly. People were out of their cars now. Not many, but enough. A man stood in the middle of the road, turning slowly in place. Phone pressed his ear, speaking to no one. Another leaned against a parked car, breathing heavily, like he'd been running without knowing where to go. None of them looked directly at passing vehicles. Their focus was inward, disconnected from the environment. That disconnect was spreading. At the next turn, I had to stop. Not for a light, for people. A group of them moved across the street without coordination, not crossing together, not even acknowledging each other. Just drifting through the space like they were following separate instructions that didn't align. I waited, engine idling, watching. One of them stumbled. Not a trip. Something slower, less controlled. He caught himself, then didn't move for a second, like he'd forgotten what he was doing. No one helped him. No one even reacted. That was the difference. It wasn't just what was happening. It was how people responded to it, or didn't. The gap between action and reaction was widening. When the street cleared, I moved again, turning back toward my primary route, where it reconnected further ahead. The timing still held, for now, but the margins were tightening. A siren cut through the air behind me. Not one, several. Different tones, overlapping, uncoordinated. Emergency response was active, but not controlled. I checked the mirror. Vehicles were approaching fast, weaving through traffic without the usual spacing. Drivers ahead of me hesitated, some pulling over, others freezing in place, unsure what to do. That hesitation created a choke point instantly. I didn't wait for it to resolve. I cut right, taking another side street before the lane collapsed completely. The ambulance surged past seconds later, barely clearing the gap. Too close. That was a pattern now. Everything was happening just ahead of failure. I pushed forward, recalculating constantly. Each turn wasn't just navigation, it was timing. Stay ahead of density. Avoid convergence points. Keep movement continuous. That was the only rule that mattered. As I approached the outer edge of the city grid, the shift became more visible. Traffic increased, not evenly, but in bursts. Clusters of vehicles moving too fast or not at all. Drivers leaning on horns without reason. Doors opening in the middle of lanes. People stepping out, arguing, trying to make sense of something that had already moved past explanation. They were reacting now. Too late. I stayed in motion, using gaps before they closed, shifting lanes before they filled, turning before decisions became limited. The plan I'd built the night before wasn't perfect, but it gave me direction when others were still searching for one. At a major intersection, I hit my first real obstruction. 3 cars angled across the road, not from a crash, but from failed coordination. One had tried to turn. Another accelerated. A third stopped too late. No major damage, just enough misalignment to block 2 lanes completely. Drivers were out of their vehicles, arguing, pointing, demanding solutions that no longer mattered. The light above them cycled from red to green to red again. Ignored. That was a collapse point, not destruction. Disorder. I didn't stop. I cut left before reaching the blockage, using a narrow service road I'd marked the night before. It wasn't ideal, tight turns, limited visibility, but it was clear. Clear was all I needed. As I pushed through, the noise of the main road faded behind me, replaced by something quieter, but not safer. The city was still functioning, but only barely, and the difference between being ahead of it and being inside, it was now measured in seconds. I didn't slow down, because slowing down meant becoming part of it. And once you're part of it, you stop moving. And if you stop moving now, you don't start again. What most people did wrong. The farther I moved from the center, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't just that people were reacting late. It was how they were reacting. The highway entrance came into view ahead, one of the major exits I'd already ruled out. Even from a distance, I could see it was failing. Cars were packed too tightly, lanes merging into each other without structure. Drivers leaned out of windows, shouting, gesturing, trying to force movement where there wasn't space for it. They had waited, and now they were paying for it. I slowed just enough to observe without getting pulled in. This wasn't congestion caused by volume. It was caused by indecision. People entering too late, trying to correct too quickly, all competing for the same limited path out. One lane would move for a few seconds, then stop completely when someone hesitated or cut across too sharply. The entire system relied on cooperation, and cooperation had already broken down. That was mistake 1, relying on shared behavior in a situation where everyone was prioritizing themselves. I turned away before the backup could extend into my path, shifting onto a secondary road that curved along the edge of the highway. From there, I could still see the buildup, but I wasn't part of it. Distance gave clarity. Up ahead, another cluster formed, smaller, but following the same pattern. A driver had stopped in the middle of the road, door open, arguing with someone in another vehicle. Not about direction, about fault. Fault didn't matter anymore. Cause didn't matter. Only movement did. But they were still operating inside old rules, trying to assign blame, resolve conflict, restore order. That was mistake 2. Trying to fix the situation instead of adapting to it. I passed them slowly, giving enough space to avoid drawing attention. Neither of them looked at me. Their focus was locked on each other, on a problem that no longer had value. Further ahead, I saw a different kind of failure. A car pulled over on the side of the road, trunk open, belongings scattered around it. Suitcases, boxes, loose items spilling into grass. A family stood nearby. 2 adults, 1 child, moving things in and out of the trunk like they were trying to reorganize under pressure. They hadn't left earlier. Now, they were trying to bring everything. That was mistake 3. Overcommitting to what you couldn't carry. In a normal situation, more preparation feels safer. More supplies, more options, more security. But in a collapsing system, excess becomes weight. Weight slows you down. Slowing down traps you. The father looked up as I passed, his expression caught somewhere between urgency and confusion. He wasn't sure what to prioritize. Nothing had been decided ahead of time. So everything became equally important. That's how you lose time. and time was the only resource that couldn't be recovered. I kept moving. The road ahead narrowed slightly, but stayed clear, not because it was safer, but because fewer people had considered it an option. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't direct. It required commitment without confirmation. Most people avoid those paths until they don't have a choice. By then, it's too late. A few miles further out, I saw the next pattern. People stopping to wait, not for traffic, for information. A small group had gathered near a gas station, phones in hand, talking over each other, trying to piece together what was happening. Some leaned against their cars, engines off, like they were settling in to figure things out before moving. They were looking for clarity. That was mistake 4. Waiting for confirmation in a situation that was already unfolding. Information systems were down. Communication was fractured. There was no central message coming that would suddenly make everything make sense. But they were still expecting one. Still believing that if they waited long enough, someone would tell them what to do. I drove past without slowing, because stopping to understand it would mean becoming part of it. And understanding wasn't necessary anymore. Only direction. As the city faded behind me, replaced by wider roads and more open space, the contrast became sharper. Behind me, reaction, hesitation, correction. Ahead, uncertainty but movement. That was a divide. Not between those who knew and those who didn't. Between those who acted early and those who waited for proof. I didn't feel ahead. I felt aligned. Aligned with a timeline that most people hadn't accepted yet. And that alignment was the only reason I was still moving while everything behind me was starting to lock in place. The mistakes weren't complex. They were predictable. Hesitation, denial, overcorrection, waiting. All of them made sense in a normal world. But this wasn't a normal world anymore. And the ones who treated it like it was were already out of time. The first safe position. The road thinned until it stopped feeling like an exit and started feeling like a choice. Fewer cars, wider gaps. The noise of the city faded behind me, replaced by something quieter. Wind moving through open space, tires on uninterrupted asphalt. It should have felt like relief. It didn't, because distance isn't the same as safety. I drove another mile past the last cluster of vehicles before turning off onto a narrow service road that cut through a stretch of unused land. It wasn't marked clearly, just a break in a tree line I'd noted on the map the night before. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. That was the point. I followed it until the main road disappeared behind me, then slowed and finally stopped near a shallow rise overlooking the area I'd just come from. Engine off. Silence settled in quickly. Not complete silence, but controlled. No horns. No overlapping voices. Just the occasional distant sound carried from far enough away that it lost urgency. I stepped out of the car and let the air hit me fully for the first time since leaving the city. It felt clearer, but not cleaner, like stepping into a place that hadn't caught up yet. That distinction mattered. I moved up the slight incline and looked back. From this distance, the city didn't look like it was failing. Buildings stood unchanged. Roads still carried movement, even if it was uneven. Nothing about it suggested collapse. But I knew better now. What looked stable from a distance was already breaking at the edges. I turned away and focused on where I was. The area wasn't ideal, but it was workable. Elevated ground gave me visibility. Limited access points reduced exposure. No immediate signs of other people. That last part carried both advantages and risks. Isolation protects. Isolation also removes support. I walked the perimeter slowly, scanning for anything I might have missed. Tracks in the dirt. Old, not recent. No fresh tire marks beyond my own. No discarded items. No signs that anyone had used this spot recently. Good, but temporary. Every place stays empty until it doesn't. I returned to the car and opened the trunk, checking supplies again, not because I needed to, but because repetition reinforces awareness. Water levels, food distribution, tools, fuel reserve. Everything accounted for. For now, I leaned against the side of the car and let my attention shift outward again, listening more than looking. Still quiet, but not inactive. Far off, I could hear something faint, metal against metal, Irregular, like something being moved or dropped without coordination. 2, distant to identify, but close enough to matter. Sound carries differently outside the city. It travels farther. That meant whatever I was hearing wasn't as far away as it felt. I checked my phone again out of habit. No signal. Still gone. That hadn't changed. Which meant whatever was happening inside the city wasn't contained to a single system failure. Communication had been cut cleanly, not degraded. That level of control didn't match randomness. It suggested intent. I pushed that thought aside for now. It didn't change what I needed to do next. Stabilize. Movement had got me here. Now I needed to hold position long enough to reassess, without losing the advantage I'd built. I moved the car slightly, angling it so I could leave quickly without needing to reverse or reposition. Small adjustment, but important. Delays don't come from big mistakes. They come from small inefficiencies stacking at the wrong moment. I kept the bag in the front seat, not in the trunk. If I had to move, I wasn't opening anything. Everything I needed had to be within reach. I stepped back again and looked over the area one more time. It felt safe. That was the problem. Because feeling safe encourages you to relax. And relaxing here would be a mistake. Nothing about this position was permanent. No barriers. No guarantees. Just distance and timing, both of which could shift without warning. The quiet around me wasn't protection. It was delay. I sat on the edge of the car, eyes scanning the tree line, the road, the horizon beyond it. Every few seconds, I checked a different angle, forcing my focus to rotate instead of settling. Still no movement nearby. Still no immediate threat. But the absence of threat wasn't the same as control. I'd seen enough already to understand that. This wasn't a safe zone. It was a gap, a temporary space between where things had already broken and where they were about to, and the only reason I was standing in that gap was because I moved before it closed. Signs this was bigger than expected. The quiet held longer than it should have. That was the first indication something didn't line up. In a normal situation, movement follows disruption. Noise travels, people scatter, systems strain, and the effects ripple outward. Even at a distance, you feel it. Sirens, traffic surges, fragmented communication bleeding into open space. But here, the quiet stayed intact. Too intact. I moved back up the incline and scanned the horizon again, this time focusing less on what I could see and more on what I expected to change. Nothing did. The road I'd come from still carried occasional movement, but it wasn't increasing. If anything, it was thinning out. Cars passed in irregular intervals, not in waves like I would expect if people were escaping in large numbers. That didn't make sense. If the city was breaking down, people should have been pouring out of it by now. Even with delays, even with hesitation, the volume should have been building. It wasn't. That meant one of two things. Either most people still didn't know what was happening, or they couldn't leave. I stayed where I was, watching longer than I needed to, letting the pattern, or lack of one, settle in. A single vehicle passed, then nothing for nearly 3 minutes. Then another, moving faster than it should have, like it had just cleared something behind it, but no sustained flow, no pressure. That wasn't natural. I walked back toward the car, but stopped halfway, something else catching my attention. Sound, not the distant metal noise from earlier, that had faded, but something new, faint, structured, almost rhythmic. I turned slightly, trying to isolate it. It wasn't coming from the road. It was coming from deeper in the direction of the city. A low, repeating pulse. Not mechanical, in a familiar way. Not construction, not traffic. Too consistent. Too controlled. I held still, listening. It stopped, not gradually, completely, like something had been turned off. I didn't like that. Random events taper. Controlled systems stop clean. I moved back to the car and pulled out the map again, not to check routes, but to orient myself relative to infrastructure, power stations, communication hubs, anything that could produce consistent output on a large scale. If systems were failing, I'd expect irregularity, surges, outages, inconsistencies. But what I was seeing and hearing felt managed, selective, that pushed the situation out of the category of uncontrolled outbreak and into something more complex. I leaned against the hood, and looked back toward the city again, narrowing my focus to the edges. The parts most people ignore when they look at something large. That's where changes show first. And there it was. Movement. Not in the streets, but above them. A helicopter cut across the skyline, low and fast, not following standard flight paths. It didn't circle. It didn't hover. It moved with direction, then disappear behind the buildings without reappearing. No news coverage. No broadcast. Just movement. A few seconds later, another followed, slightly higher, same trajectory. That confirmed it. This wasn't being handled publicly. It was being managed selectively. I checked my phone again out of reflex. Still no signal. But now that absence meant more. If communication was down across the board, it would be chaos. People would be reacting louder, faster. Panic would be visible even from here. But communication wasn't just down. It was contained, which meant information wasn't flowing. Not because it couldn't, but because it wasn't allowed to. That changed the scale of the situation. I stepped back in the car and scanned the area again, this time not just for immediate threats, but for patterns that didn't belong. Nothing close. Still quiet. Still stable on the surface. But the structure underneath, it felt different now. Less like something breaking. More like something being controlled as it broke. That's worse. Because uncontrolled systems collapse unpredictably, but controlled ones collapse with direction. And direction means intent. I thought back to the call. You were flagged. At the time, it felt like a detail that didn't matter. Now it did, because if this wasn't random, if this was structured, contained, managed, then the warning hadn't been guesswork. It had been timing. I looked out toward the city one more time, letting that realization settle in. This wasn't just about getting out. It was about understanding what I'd just stepped away from, and whether stepping away was enough. Because if whatever was happening had reached beyond the city, then distance wouldn't be protection. It would just be delay. I exhaled slowly and reached the car door, the shift in thinking settling into something more focused. Survival was still the priority. But now there was something else layered into it. Awareness. Because whatever this was, it was bigger than I'd planned for. The encounter that changed everything. I heard the engine before I saw the vehicle. Faint at first, uneven, like it was being pushed harder than it should have been. I turned toward the road instinctively, stepping away from the car and up the incline for a clearer view. A pickup truck came into sight, moving too fast for the narrow stretch it was on. It swerved slightly as it hit a dip, corrected late, then accelerated again like the driver was trying to outrun something he couldn't see anymore. Or something he could. I stayed still. Movement attracts attention. Stillness buys time. The truck slowed when it spotted my car, not stopping immediately, but enough to signal recognition. That pause carried weight. He wasn't just passing through. He was deciding. So was I. The truck rolled to a stop about 20 yards away, angled slightly toward me. Engine still running. Driver's side window down. One man, mid-30s, maybe older. Face drawn tight, eyes scanning past me before settling back. You alone? He asked. No greeting. No hesitation. That told me everything I needed to know about where he was mentally. Yes, I said. He nodded once, like that confirmed something. You come from the city? I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't trust him, but because the answer mattered more to him than the question did to me. Yeah, I said finally. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. It's worse now, he said. Way worse than it was an hour ago. I watched him carefully. No visible injuries. No erratic movement. His voice held tension, but not panic. Controlled enough to be useful. What did you see? I asked. He exhaled once, like he'd been holding it in too long. People aren't just collapsing anymore, he said. They're changing. Not fast, but not slow either. Enough that you notice it if you're paying attention. I didn't interrupt. They stop responding first, he continued, like something disconnects. Then they start moving again, but it's not the same, not coordinated, not aware. That matched what I'd seen. But hearing it from someone else changed the weight of it. It wasn't isolated. It was consistent. How far out? I asked. Closer than you think, he said. It's not staying in one place. That wasn't good. It meant the timeline was compressing faster than I'd estimated. He leaned slightly toward the window, lowering his voice without realizing it. You heading north? Yes. He nodded again, more firmly this time. Good. Don't take the main routes. They're locking up. People are stopping in the middle of the road, just getting out, leaving cars. Doesn't matter if they're sick or not. Once it starts, everyone reacts the same way. I already knew that, but hearing it confirmed narrowed the margin even further. He hesitated then, just for a second. That hesitation mattered more than anything he'd said. You got room? He asked. There it was. The decision point. Not hypothetical anymore. Real. Immediate. I glanced at the truck, then back at him. He wasn't armed. At least not visibly. No one else inside. Just him. Taking him meant adding variables. Another person. Another set of decisions. Another potential point of failure. Leaving him meant maintaining control. But it also meant walking away from information, from assistance, from the possibility that survival wasn't meant to be done alone. That was the shift. Up until now, everything had been calculated around independence. Now that equation was changing. What's your plan? I asked. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Had one, he said. Doesn't apply anymore. That was honest. More honest than most people would be in that position. I know a route that stays clear longer, I said. Not guaranteed, but better than the highway. He watched me for a second, weighing that. Then we move now, he said. Not please. Not can I. Move. Together. I looked back toward the city one more time, then at the road ahead. Distance wasn't enough anymore. The pattern was expanding, adapting, and staying alone meant carrying every decision without support. I opened the passenger door. Get in, I said. He didn't waste time. Engine off. Door open. He crossed the distance quickly, moving with purpose now that the decision had been made. As he got in, I caught the way he scanned the area again, same as I had earlier. Not nervous. Aware. Good. I started the engine, pulling back onto the narrow road without hesitation. What's your name? I asked. Marcus, he said. I nodded once. No more introductions. No more questions that didn't matter immediately. The situation had shifted again. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was coordination. And from this point forward, every decision carried more than one life with it. The cost of the right decision. We didn't talk for the first few minutes after Marcus got in. Not because there was nothing to say, but because both of us were recalculating. The situation had changed the moment I opened that door. Every route, every decision, every margin I'd built into the plan now had to count for two people instead of one. That was the cost. Not immediate danger, but reduced flexibility. I kept my focus on the road, maintaining speed without pushing it too far. Control mattered more than distance now. One mistake at this stage wouldn't just slow me down, it would compound. Marcus leaned back slightly, still scanning through the side mirror, watching the direction we'd come from. You left early, he said. Yes. Good call. Simple. No judgment. Just acknowledgement. But that wasn't enough to settle what had already started to build. Because leaving early meant leaving things behind. People. Places. Decisions that weren't made because there wasn't time, or because making them would have changed everything. I thought about Ryan. The message I didn't answer. The question I avoided. At the time, it felt like a small choice. A way to avoid unnecessary friction. Now it felt like something else. Final. I tightened my grip on the wheel slightly, forcing my focus back to what was in front of me. Reflection without action wasn't useful. Not now. Marcus shifted in his seat. You got anyone back there? He asked. The question landed heavier than it should have. Yeah, I said. He nodded once, like that was enough. I did too, he said after a moment. Didn't think it would move this fast. There was again, speed. Everyone underestimated it. That was the difference between reacting and preparing. Reaction assumes time. Preparation assumes loss of it. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything useful to add. We drove in silence for a while, the road stretching out ahead of us, still clear enough to maintain pace. But the further we moved, the more the weight of what we'd done or hadn't done started to settle in. Survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about what you accept to make that happen. And the earlier you act, the more you leave behind. That's the part people don't talk about. Because it doesn't feel like survival. It feels like abandonment. I checked the rearview mirror again. Nothing close. No immediate threat. But distance doesn't erase consequence. It just delays it. Marcus spoke again, quieter this time. I passed a neighborhood on the way out, he said. People standing outside, talking, trying to figure out what was going on. Some of them weren't even paying attention to what was happening around them. Just waiting. I knew the type. Waiting for confirmation. Waiting for someone else to decide first. They're not getting out, he added. Not a question. A conclusion. I exhaled slowly. No, I said, because by the time they realized what was happening, the system they depended on to leave would already be failing. That was the trade. Leave early and you risk being wrong. Leave late and you remove the option entirely. Marcus leaned his head back, eyes closing for a second. Feels wrong, he said. It did. Even knowing it was the correct decision. Even knowing staying would have changed the outcome. Because survival doesn't reward fairness. It rewards timing. I glanced at him briefly, then back to the road. Wrong doesn't change the outcome, I said. He didn't respond. Not because he disagreed, but because there wasn't anything left to argue. The road ahead curved slightly, opening into a wider stretch with better visibility. I adjusted speed accordingly, keeping momentum without overcommitting. Every movement now had to account for more than just efficiency. It had to account for responsibility. That was the second cost. Not just what you leave behind, but what you take on. Before, every decision only affected me. Now it affected him too. That meant less risk tolerance, less margin for error, and less room for hesitation. I felt in the way I drove, the way I scanned the environment, the way I calculated distance and timing. More controlled, more deliberate, because mistakes weren't just personal anymore. They were shared. I looked ahead again, the road stretching out into uncertainty, the city behind us fading into something that no longer belonged to us. We were alive. That was the result of the decision, but the cost of that decision didn't stay behind. It came with us, in silence, in memory, in every choice we made from that point forward. And the further we went, the clearer it became. Survival wasn't a clean break. It was a weight you carried. What comes after survival? The road didn't end. It just stopped belonging to anything familiar. Buildings thinned out until they disappeared completely, replaced by open land and scattered structures that looked more like placeholders and destinations. No clear signs. No markers that told you where one place ended and another began. Just space. That should have made things simpler. It didn't. Because once you leave the immediate threat behind, the next question isn't where you are. It's what you're moving toward. And I didn't have a clear answer for that yet. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, looking out toward the horizon instead of behind us for the first time since he got in. So what's the plan now? He asked. It was the right question, and the one I'd been avoiding. Short term. I said, keep moving until we're outside the spread zone. Find a position we can hold longer than a few hours. Somewhere with visibility, limited access, and resources nearby. He nodded slowly. And long term. I didn't answer immediately, because long term implied stability. And nothing about what we'd seen suggested stability was coming back anytime soon. That depends on what this turns into, I said. He looked at me, waiting for more. If it burns out, we move back toward infrastructure. If it spreads, I paused, choosing the next words carefully. Then we stopped thinking in terms of cities. That landed. Because once you remove cities from the equation, everything changes. Supply chains, communication, movement. The systems people rely on don't degrade, they disappear. And when that happens, survival stops being temporary. It becomes a structure. Marcus leaned back again, processing that, then looked down at his hands for a moment before speaking. You think it's going to spread that far? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought about the call. The voice, the certainty. You were flagged. That part hadn't made sense at the time. Now it did, because if this was contained, if it was isolated, there would be no reason to warn specific individuals ahead of time. Warnings like that don't happen unless there's projection, a model, something that shows how this unfolds beyond a single location. I think it already has, I said finally. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. We both understood what that meant. The road ahead stretched out, uninterrupted, but didn't feel open anymore. It felt like a narrowing path, options reducing the further we went, not because of obstacles, but because of what we were leaving behind. I adjusted speed slightly, keeping it steady without pushing too far ahead of what I could read. The environment was still quiet. Too quiet. No distant traffic. No aircraft overhead. No signs of organized movement in either direction. Just absence. And absence isn't neutral. It means something has already passed through or is being kept out. I glanced at the fuel gauge. Still good. Supplies intact. No immediate pressure. But that wouldn't last. Nothing did anymore. We're going to need more than just distance, Marcus said after a while. I know. People. Information. Something. He wasn't wrong. Isolation worked in the short term. It gave control, reduced variables, kept things manageable. But long term, isolation limits growth, limits awareness, and eventually limits survival. I thought back to the helicopter, the controlled movement, the silence in communication. There was something operating inside the situation that we didn't fully understand yet. Something organized. We find a signal, I said, not broadcast, direct, something controlled. That's where we get answers. Marcus looked at me, narrowing his eyes slightly. You think there's still something running out there? I think something never stopped. That was the difference. This didn't feel like a system collapsing. It felt like one system being replaced by another. Slower, quieter, more controlled. The road curved ahead, disappearing behind a line of trees that cut visibility just enough to force a decision without full information. I didn't slow down, because waiting for full information was what everyone else had done, and I'd already seen where that led. As we moved into the curve, the light shifted slightly, shadows stretching across the road in uneven patterns. For a moment, it felt like stepping into something undefined. No longer part of the world we'd left, not yet part of whatever was coming next. That space in between. That's where we were now. Alive, moving, but not safe. Not yet. I kept my eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel, the next phase already forming, without needing to be fully defined. Because survival isn't the end. It's the entry point. And whatever came after this was already waiting